Well, good morning and welcome to hsa-bc's webinar, When Caring Hurts, Vicarious Trauma, with your instructor, Amanda Thiessen. I'm your host for today. My name is Sarah Kift, and that's who you'll be chatting to when you chat in the question section. I've worked in the frontline nonprofit sector for over 15 years, including in Vancouver's downtown east side at Carnegie Community Centre. And I develop and host webinars for hsa-bc as well as instruct mental health first aid and produce podcasts for mental health organizations here in Vancouver. So again, when you're using that question section, that's me who you'll be chatting to. And I'll do my best to share your questions and comments with Amanda as they come up. So it's a stressful time for so many of us, as well as those we provide services to. So I just want to start off by saying thank you for taking the time to join us today. And hopefully the content we provide will help you to lead well and with courage in the midst of this crisis. We welcome your input as we discuss things today, as well as your stories, ideas, and questions. So we're going to run a little poll here. This is just a way for us to get a sense of what kind of work you're doing right now and what your level of exposure is in terms of trauma. So what type of work do you do? And you can check all that apply, so the numbers won't add up to 100. Frontline, are you in management on the front line or behind the scenes? Do you face or hear about traumatic situations on a regular basis, or you hear about it once in a while? This really helps Amanda to tailor her content and think about who's on the other end of the line today. People are saying all of them. That's also a valid answer. In frontline work often, especially in nonprofits, our job descriptions are very rarely the sum of everything we do, hey? Sometimes we're doing multiple things at multiple times or all at the same time. I've totally been there. Frontline, management, de-escalation, services, all of it, all at once. Most of us are in frontline work. That's great. It's also great to have some people who work behind the scenes. We really welcome your input here because, as we know, trauma affects all of us in different ways. And 68% of us face or hear about traumatic situations on a regular basis. So that's good to know. Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you're here today. Seems like it's a timely topic for you. I love this part, getting to introduce your instructor to you. This is Amanda Thiessen, and she specializes in helping individuals and organizations manage workplace stressors and make positive changes. So as a stress strategist, Amanda works with individuals through the process of inquiry to support people in gaining clarity and finding solutions to challenges. And she offers a range of workshops to organizations to facilitate the creation of safe, supportive, and positive work environments. She's worked for over 15 years in the nonprofit world, and she has firsthand knowledge of the kinds of experiences that exemplify working in frontline capacities. And her experience includes working in the areas of addictions, victim services, mental health, and developmental disabilities. So Amanda, it's wonderful to have you here today with us. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar here. And I have a question for you before we start all this. My question for you is, what are you hoping to get out of today? What would you like to walk away with in the next hour? Another way to think about this is, what's something you want to know at the end of this that you don't know now?
Great.
And I just want you to type that into Sarah. And before we jump into sort of the content that I normally do, I want to acknowledge that this is not the usual situation we're in, right? Because of the COVID crisis. So I want to normalize a little bit of what's going on for people. I want to just say that, you know, some of us are probably getting pretty tired. So what usually happens in our body is we have this crisis response, we have the adrenaline, we have really it's a stress response, right? That goes on physically for us. And then your body can't stay in that mode. We're not wired to stay in that mode. So then what happens is you start to go into this mode of feeling fatigued. And that can come up in lots of different ways. So I like to think about this in a number of ways. So one of the lenses I like to look at this through is self-regulation, which I know is out there, and it means regulating your body system so that you can get out of that fight, fight, or freeze mode. The way I like to see that is actually connecting with yourself. So when I talk about regulation, what I'm really talking about is how to connect with yourself through this. Because what happens is we start to feel really unsafe, right? In a crisis. So we start to do all the things. So the over shopping, doing all the things to feel safe again. And we need to actually start feeling safe in our bodies. So the crisis now, right? We've done the crisis mode thing for a while, and we might still go up and down with the crisis, but the downside of that is usually fatigue. So people try to regulate through a number of ways. So I just want to normalize for you, if you're regulating through, numbing activities like watching TV, overeating, whatever it is that you're doing, that's a normal response. That's your body's wisdom in trying to sort of regulate what's happening. And also, I just want to give you permission throughout this workshop or this webinar to just sit back and, just listen. Or if you want to take notes, but do what feels good for you today.
Yeah, and I
Sarah,
also
do we have any response? So go ahead.
We do, yeah. I forgot to mention that there's a number of handouts today that are really helpful. So there's a PDF of this PowerPoint. There's also a couple of sort of FAQ sheets on personal resilience and self-regulation, and there's a PDF on organizational practices around this. So you can find those all in the handout section, and you can download them, or you can contact us to get them at a later time if you can't get them today. So.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah, what are people saying in terms of expectations or what they're hoping to get out of today?
Yeah, so lots of good responses coming in here. To be more aware of how trauma affects us and to have a self-care piece. How do we define trauma? How do we not take on people's trauma in a way that it makes it more about us and our reaction? And looking to learn anything and everything that, sorry, I just want to, I got cut off there. Sorry, I'm just reading this.
Sure, no problem. That sounds perfect. What people are saying is exactly what we're going to talk about today, so it's really fitting. There's two things I want to do before we go on. One thing I want to do is reframe kind of the way we're talking about vicarious trauma and the way we're talking about compassion, fatigue, and burnout and those kinds of things. And what I want us to think about is actually the systemic pieces. So this is like the reasons that people are homeless and see ourselves, so colonization, things like that, right? And see ourselves as, so racism, colonization, kind of those big structural things that create trauma. And I want to see us as part of that. So you may be part of that individually because of your social location. So that means like where you are in terms of, your background, your ethnicity, your age, all those pieces, right? And then I want you to see your acts of self-care as actually acts of resistance to this bigger system. Because I think what happens in Western Canadian culture, well, an American culture, because a lot of this research is actually from the States, right, is that it becomes individualized, right? It becomes like, oh, this is the problem of the individual, or even like recently the problem of the organization, but there's actually a whole big system and history and context that goes along with it that's much bigger. And so as we're talking about this, I want to reframe for you self-care, and I want you to see it as acts of resistance, of ways to stay hopeful and to ways to push back and to actually create change and transformation within a system. Okay, now comes the part where I want to focus on what's actually going on for you in your body. So I want you to just take a minute, take a deep breath. It's one of the ways we regulate. So deep breath in and extended exhale, so long out exhale. So do it again. If you want, you can extend your hand in front of you like your right hand if you're right-handed, your left hand if you're left-handed. Extend it in front of you like you're pointing to something with your index finger out. And then breathe in. And as you breathe out, I want you to draw S's in the air with your finger. So just give it a go. Ready? We'll do it together. So your dominant arm out with your index finger pointed. Breath in. As you breathe out, you're making S's in the air. So you have an extended breath out. And that helps you start regulating your system. And then what I want you to do is put your hand, whichever hand you like, on your chest, kind of where your heart is. And I want you to just tune in to how that feels for you. What's that like? Is it uncomfortable? Is it comforting? Is it hot? Is it cold? What's that like for you? Just leave it there for a minute and kind of tune into that. What are you noticing about that? Then maybe take your hand off for a minute and see what that's like. And then put it back on. This is the last time. Put it back on. Connect with that again. What does that feel like for you? If you want to, you can put your other hand over it. Just connect to what that's like for you right now in this moment. And then what I want you to do is ask yourself, what do you actually need in this moment? Maybe you need to adjust yourself to get comfortable, or grab some water. Or maybe you've connected to that fatigue feeling. And just be with that. Whatever you're feeling, however you're coping with COVID, with work, whatever you're doing is okay. And I want you to take it as a sign from your body that it has wisdom. Okay. Now we're going to start kind of into the bigger webinar. And I want to connect with you first about that exercise. I want you to type into Sarah what that was like for you, what you noticed, what was the needs that were coming up. I think communal kind of sharing about this stuff, like what's working, what's helpful, what are you noticing, is really normalizing, right? It really helps us normalize what's actually going on because we realize we're not the only ones. And that not being alone thing is a big part of actually pushing back against trauma.
So people are talking about being very conscious of what's going on around them in terms of the noise, and then also but feeling the tension and the tiredness in their bodies. A lot of people talked about how it was very calming and comforting. They got a sense of warmth and being soothed. And somebody even wrote when they put their hand on their chest, they felt love and they felt like they were being hugged. And then also someone's talking about it offered a needed moment of stillness to stop multitasking.
Yeah, and whatever your experience is, there's no wrong or right. I worked with a client whose experience of that was actually really negative. And that's part of it too, right? So the idea is to actually start tuning in and just acknowledging for yourself what you need in the moment. And to create, so in your day, to kind of create these moments where you can regulate, where you can connect to yourself. And one of the handouts is actually on that, so it gives you some strategies. Some of them we're going to talk about today, some of them we aren't. Because that's really a key piece in continuing to regulate throughout your day. It's not like a one-time thing. It's not a one-time knowledge. It's about reconnecting with yourself so that your body knows that it's safe. And I'm going to talk more about sort of the physiology of that as we go through the webinar.
It's interesting. So someone just made a comment about how having your eyes closed at work is kind of stressful. So even closing your eyes for a second, because we're in frontline work and we got to be paying attention to what's going on all the time. But how actually that can give you permission to slow down, even if it's just closing your eyes for 10 seconds.
Yeah. Well, and my next question, if you're sitting in front of me, I would ask you, what are you thinking about that? What are you noticing about that? Right? Because it is also okay to keep your eyes open. If it increases stress levels or if it feels like you can't connect to yourself because you have this other voice in your head talking, you know, like the anxious thought voice talking. It's okay to do it however it works for you. If that is relieving for you, like that closing the eyes, even though there is that like alarming conversation in your brain, then do that. Okay, I'm going to move on here. So building awareness. So as we go, I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to talk about some things, and I want you to think of, you know, how it relates to you or your colleagues. So the process of change for people is usually they notice things in other people first and then in themselves. So just know that for yourself. So when I'm talking, you'll probably think of a colleague or somebody you know who's showing that, and you're like, man, they have some bad like compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma or whatever. And you know, it's all good to recognize, right? But also think of like building your own awareness around it. And then the other piece I would talk about is, we're not going to talk about like this too deeply in this, but try to think of it as like building awareness around some of the, you know, systemic stuff that I was talking about at the beginning that's creating this. So one interesting thing we know about vicarious trauma research is most of it has been done from a middle class, upper middle class perspective, right? I would say white dominated, although I don't have any research to back that up. And so what that does is it means that it usually centers the individual as the problem, right? So start building around awareness around the bigger stuff, right? So what are some of the symptoms and how do they show up? So let's talk about this. So I'm going to be talking about it quite like in different categories, but what you need to know is that symptoms actually overlap. So there's burnout. We're going to talk about that last. Burnout is a kind of it's basically when you can't re-energize, right? So it can be from a workplace, it can be from a workplace plus your life, because we're holistic, right? So it can be that you're looking after a parent or kids or a roommate or whatever, plus you're doing this other work, right? And you're kind of in a workplace that's difficult to work in, right? That can lead to burnout. But it also has a compassion fatigue piece in it because you're actually looking after somebody. Vicarious trauma is actually a bigger process that happens, and there's two pieces to it. So vicarious trauma, there's a piece around like your worldview shifts. And then there's also the piece where you hear somebody's story and you actually become traumatized from that. Then there's the primary trauma. We're not talking about primary trauma in this, but that's when actually something really like traumatic happens to you. So it can be work violence. It can be big T or small t, like it can be an assault, or it can just be like that suddenly you were laid off. Like that can be a primary trauma, right? So let's talk first about vicarious trauma here. So what this looks like, so it's a process that happens over time. It's a process that happens to people who are exposed to other people's trauma. And what it looks like is that there's a shift in your relationship to major psychological needs. So this is like your relationship with safety. So for example, I worked in victim services for a long time. So my relationship to safety changed. It was difficult for me to go out at nighttime. I would avoid places I knew where stuff had happened. I would never ever leave any kind of like way to get into my house or into, where I was living, because like outside, like a key under something or anything like that, because I heard about break and entries all the time, right? And so my perspective became skewed. And I worked on a call line. So I worked for Victim Link. So I heard like hundreds and hundreds of stories. So what the police do is they give people a card that has our number on the back. So immediately after crime, many people will call us. So I heard many, many, many stories. And it really started to skew my perspective of how safe the world was. So one way you can start combating that stuff is to do the opposite, right? Because you have to basically retrain your brain that the world is mostly safe. So an example of that would be, I knew somebody who would leave their car open, so they wouldn't lock their car because they were trying to teach their brain that actually the world is a safe place. And surprisingly, their car was never broken into. This is in Vancouver. But you try to like retrain your brain around stuff. So trust. So I was working with a group who are counselors, and they work with kids, like youth and kids, but their mandate is to actually provide services to youth and children who have been sexually abused. So one of the things that came up in there is around trusting men and trusting. So for example, like never having a male babysitter, right? Because the cost just seems too high, right? So it starts to mess. So vicarious trauma starts to mess with some of your major psychological ways of seeing the world and your belief systems. So control. So what happens sometimes around trauma is trauma equals chaos, right? So what happens with trauma is people knuckle down on control. So this can be like trying to control others. It can be trying to control certain parts of your life. So like with women, it can be around food, or well, for men too. But I would say, like, I see that pretty often with women, is control around food, and there's lots of pieces that go with that. It's not necessarily just vicarious trauma. It can also be around, so the other piece is around intimacy. And you might be noticing this now more than other times. So this is emotional intimacy. It can also be sexual intimacy. So with emotional intimacy, like one of the things that happens when we start to, this would overlap into vicarious trauma, but one of the things that can happen if we've been in crisis mode a long time, because we're not like wired to be in crisis mode a long time, what can happen is we withdraw. Right? So withdrawing from relationships that are important to us. If you're talking about something and you're just like, I just can't talk about this anymore. Right? Kind of reach that limit and you withdraw, a withdrawal from intimacy. That's a really common vicarious trauma kind of symptom, right? Mixed with some compassion fatigue / burnout stuff. If you work like with sexual trauma, then it could be that your own sexual life just kind of shuts down. Right? Because you get intrusive thoughts and you get kind of like, it kind of gets icky for you. And that's like a shift, right? A shift in that relationship you have with your own sexuality that starts happening. I want you to start thinking about for yourselves, like, what are some belief systems that have come out of your work? So around safety, so how safe are you perceiving the world to be these days, right? How much trust do you have in other people? I remember, I still do this sometimes, but like, I have this thought, like when we meet new people, I have this thought of like, yeah, you just never really know like who people are. So even if they're presenting kind or like whatever, I have this like, this feeling that, you know, they could do anything. They're not to be trusted, right? Nobody's to be trusted 100%. And I won't go on and on about this, but it actually messed with me a lot when I married my partner, because he's a guy. And yeah, I had some real like trust stuff to work through. And I think part of it was vicarious trauma from working in the field. Okay, I'm just gonna whiz through some of this. So the other pieces is identity. So what happens with identity with vicarious trauma is your identity becomes wholly about caring, right? Caring for others. And you kind of start missing the bigger pieces around like other parts of yourself. So what I often say to people around this is make sure you're nurturing the parts of yourself that are creative, right? That aren't related to work, the hobbies you have, as much as you can. I know that this is really complicated for people, especially these days. But try and nurture those things, right? As much as you can. Because those things help you kind of expand your identity and not just become trapped in this like helping mode. So spirituality, so when I talk about spirituality, the thing I'm mostly talking about is not your sort of religious beliefs or it's more around like hope and meaning, right? Purpose, hope, meaning, that kind of stuff. So what's your relationship like to that? So sometimes what happens is people will have, yeah, just some really big questions around this. And I always encourage people, you know, if they are part of a sort of a traditional religious group, to kind of talk about some of this stuff, talk this stuff through with the people who they trust within their, you know, religion. And even if you don't, to kind of think for yourself around like, what makes you feel purposeful, what brings meaning to you, right? Because one of the things that happens around vicarious trauma is we start losing hope. So it's not just hope for ourselves, it's hopes for clients as well, right? That things will ever change for them, that that we're actually effective in our work. All that needs to be seen as actually vicarious trauma thoughts, right? And so the other branch of vicarious trauma is actually PTSD symptoms. So this is intrusive thoughts, or like it's kind of like taking home other people's stuff, right? So if you're dreaming other people's stories they've told you, or you do the numbing and the avoidance stuff, that can be related to PTSD. Okay. So one of the key resiliency tools here is knowing your own vulnerabilities in this. So, so this is knowing for yourself what really bothers you. So of the stuff you've heard, of the stuff that kind of resonates with you when we're talking about vicarious trauma, right? What are the stories that really bother you? So, yeah, which stories are hardest for you to hear? And this might shift and change. So the thing with vicarious trauma is it's not the same all the time. So you might be doing really great, and then you might not be doing great. And this can be through circumstance, it can be on a day-to-day thing. So this also means the stories that are hardest for you to hear might shift and change. So when I was working on the downtown east side there, and I was working at BC 211. So this was the victim link job I had. And while I was working there, I was also looking after my grandparents who were elderly, and I was quite close to them, and they were quite vulnerable in their old age. So I could really see the shift happening. I could really see their vulnerability. I could see how society treated them as invisible. And, you know, I hurt for them because I love them and I know them my whole life, and I was part of caring for them. So what that meant for me is that the hardest stories to hear were actually things around elder abuse. And it was just really tough because it was so personal for me. And so one of the ways I coped with that is I asked colleagues to help me out, and I would, you know, transfer those calls over to them because they weren't as affected by it as I was. And you know, that passed, like after my grandparents passed, it didn't affect me in the same way that it did. So it doesn't mean that I wasn't empathetic towards it, but it just means that it wasn't as personal for me. So what stories for you are hardest to hear? You can type it in, you can write it down. Sometimes this stuff is around kids or around self-harm, things like that. But just know for yourself kind of what your vulnerabilities are. So I'll give you a second to do that. And then what I want you to think about is actually creating a debriefing plan for yourself. So organizations can do this. So organizations can create like a debriefing plan where they basically, you create some cultural rules in your organization about it, because a lot of what happens at work is like the way we debrief informally by saying things like, oh, hey, whoever, guess what so-and-so just told me, right? That's how debriefing actually happens. And there's no kind of dialogue in our workplaces around how people are doing with those stories, right? So one thing you can do is create a culture in your work around saying like, hey, I got to talk about this. Are you okay to hear this right now? So you get consent, you know? And then the second part is to say, what are you okay hearing? It has to do with this. And you kind of give the framework, right? It has to do with an assault. What part of that are you okay hearing? Right? And the other person, what happens with that is you give the other person permission to say like, oh man, like I have my limit today, so I actually can't hear this stuff. Right? Or they can say like, I'm okay with this part, not that part. Right? It puts a control with the other person, so we're not just spreading the trauma around. Now, the other part of debriefing I want you to think about is just think for yourself, like, where do you tell those stories? So one thing I would recommend not doing is talking to people who aren't in the trauma world, because I think that sometimes it's actually really traumatizing for people who don't have any training or anything like that. And I would say, think for yourself, are there colleagues that you can talk to? Are there friends outside of your workplace, but who work in the field or industry similar to yours, who you can talk to? And you can just make an agreement with people like that, or you can just do it informally. Like if they're just a friend, you can just do it informally, right? I would say just make sure you have some consent around it so that you're not passing on trauma. Counselors are great for debriefing. And maybe your organization has a counseling plan. There's lots of free counseling available, especially right now. So yeah, like the BC Psychology Association has a free half hour for anybody who's feeling like that they're having psychological issues due to COVID stuff. But that's not kind of a long-term plan, right? So talking to counselors, there's free counseling through some of the universities for their clinical programs. Those usually run from September to April. There's also, so Burnaby Mental Health, I think it's Burnaby Mental Health. Anyways, they run a website where it's students, but it's all free. So you could actually just talk to somebody. Like what I find really helpful is just being able to get it out, right? So kind of make a plan for yourself. Write out for yourself sometime, like, where am I going to go? Where am I going to talk about this stuff? Right? And sort of like, and commit to it, like have an actual plan around it so that you're doing it once a month. I see a counselor once a month. I talk about all my stuff, right? It's great. She says like, oh yeah, that's so hard. I'm like, yeah, it is. It's really hard, right? But it's enough. It's enough to kind of get it out there. And so it's not stuck inside of me. So here's a question around like, what do you typically do? And then what are you actually willing to try that might be different than what you have done? And you can type that into Sarah if you kind of need to process it a bit. I would say write it down or talk to somebody about it. Do something with it. Don't just keep it in your thinking bucket, because often the thinking bucket stuff is low commitment, right? We sometimes have to verbalize it or get it out to actually make a commitment to this. And remember that this, like, we can frame it as self-care, but we can also frame it as like, this is a way to resist some of the intrinsic oppression that happens, right? And the injustices. So this can actually be an action against social injustice. The other thing I want you to think about is meaningful relationships. So that's another resiliency tool. It's interesting, right? Like one thing I kind of talk about sometimes with organizations is moving away from this like staff, this idea of having staff teams to having like people-centered teams, right? Because relationships is what helps us stay in the work. It helps us normalize our experience. It helps us stay hopeful. And there's a number of different kinds of relationships that are really helpful in this. So one of them is seeking social support, right? So this can be, one thing that works really well is having a mentor. Oh, that's down below. I'm gonna talk about it anyway. So having a mentor, so somebody that's been in the field longer than you, that you can just talk to. So it can be that you talk about things actually in your work. It can be that you talk about how to do work, like how to be in your organization, because every organizational culture is different, right? If you're someone with seniority, maybe thinking about like, who can you sort of mentor in this, right? Who are you open to helping out? So this can be a source of advice, right? Somebody you go for advice or emotional support. There's different kinds of relationships. Like it's good to have relationships within your industry, I would say, where you can get mentorship, where you can get a chance to debrief, where you can get advice, right, from somebody on how to work with a client or whatever it is. But you also need relationships that aren't related to work. So you need relationships where you talk about other stuff, where you talk about your art, where you talk about whatever that is for you, where you talk about your activities, like soccer teams, something physical you do, right? It can be anything, but the idea is to get away from like just talking about like centralizing your identity around work stuff, right? And having these other conversations It's part of the way that pushes back against vicarious trauma is because it's shifting your identity, right? It's part of that identity piece where you're actually giving permission for other parts of yourself to come out and explore other parts of yourself.
Amanda, I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you're going to go into this a little bit more, but there's some questions around how a debrief would actually look.
Okay.
Did you want to do that quickly with me, or?
I'm happy to do it.
Sure.
Oh, you mean, like what the words are that you'd say?
Yeah.
Okay. So before I go into that, though, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
But before I go into that, what I want to say is you can get somebody to come into your organization and supervise a debriefing. You can do debriefings in staff meetings, and I would say allot enough time for them. So this is what I would do. So Sarah, if you were coming to me around this, let's say I had a story do you want to do it where I have a story to tell you? Why don't I do that first?
Sure.
So Sarah, you're my colleague, yeah?
Yeah.
And this thing just happened. Somebody told me this thing, right? And I would say, hey, Sarah, so-and-so, or I wouldn't name them necessarily depending on the situation, but they just told me this thing that's really bugging me. Are you feeling up to talking about that today?
Yeah, but I don't really want to hear any specific details, but I'm happy to hear about how it made you feel.
Sure. Yeah, so it just made me feel really icky inside because I felt like whatever, right? So on goes the conversation. You also can do like, are you willing to hear me about it? This is what it is, kind of, right? It's about whatever. Right. It's about this really crappy thing that happened to them or domestic violence or like whatever it is. You can kind of give the big piece around it.
Yeah, and then I would say, yeah, I'm fine to hear that right now, or I think I can't hear that at the moment, or that's really hard for me to hear.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's part of a healthy like organizational system too, right? Where you're giving people actual permission to have boundaries, right? And actually like look after themselves within the organization. Okay. Is that helpful for people?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I think what happens is we get afraid. It's our Canadian politeness or our caregiving. And so we see that someone's upset and they've just heard a story or experienced some vicarious trauma and we want to care for them. And I get nervous around saying, I can't hear that right now because it feels like I'm shutting them down. But actually, you can say, I see that you're having a hard time. I can't really handle stories like that. So let's, try to figure out how we can make it work. Like, I'd love to hear about how you're feeling, but I don't need
and maybe that's too much for you too, right? And I don't think I think part of the key is actually to create a organizational culture around it. So you talk about this in staff meeting, you have some training around it, right? So it actually becomes practice. Like that's what you actually want to do. You need people in leadership to actually be practicing it, right? So that it kind of like becomes the norm.
So it's called low impact debriefing and you can actually get trained in it. Yeah, Amanda does that kind of training.
For sure. So another tool that you can use, so this is a mental resiliency tool, is professional development. Now this one is interesting for me. So there's tons and tons of research out there that says like, so the more training you have, the better off you are. With social workers, they did some studies with social workers and they found that social workers with MSW had, so that's a master's degree versus sort of a bachelor's degree, had lower levels of vicarious trauma. Now, the reason that's interesting to me is because what that starts saying is that, so people who are privileged, right, to have the training, to have the money, to have the time, right, actually have lower levels of vicarious trauma. So I used to always include this kind of like, this handout that was like, a rate yourself, see where you're at kind of thing. I don't include it anymore because I think what it's actually doing is rating your privilege. And I don't think that's necessarily helpful, right? So it's okay for organizations to do, it's good to have professional development. We know that works. But which organizations are going to be able to do more professional development? More funding, right? You know what I'm saying? Like there's a whole system around this that allows people to do professional development or not. For you yourself, I think it's important to do it as much as you can because we know that it creates, some resiliency around this stuff and some understanding. but just know that that's also linked to privilege.
Yeah, so
Right?
as a frontline worker, sometimes it's really, when I worked for the city on the front line, there was all these trainings going on all the time at City Hall, and they were
Mm-hmm.
free, but I could never get time off to go to them because I was
That's
needed
right.
in my
Yeah.
job, and it was very
Yeah.
hard to actually get the day off to go do a training. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, the other thing I always think about is something that you do as a side thing that you really
Mm-hmm.
like and that you want to pursue on your own, if you have the
Mm-hmm.
time for that.
Yes. Yeah. Totally.
So like I
Yeah.
took a bunch of like community college psychology courses that I didn't do in my degree while I was working in the downtown east side. And that it was like a time for me to be a student and get some insight and learn a few things that helped me in my work but was separate from my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. Okay, I'm going to move on to this one here. So one of the things that can really sort of exacerbate some of the symptoms people experience is that we're actually in a system where there's a lot of injustice happening. So whether it's through colonization or gender inequality or racism or whatever it is, right? There's an injustice happening. And so there's a number of ways to battle that injustice, but I would say that feeling of helplessness that comes with it and that anxiety that comes with it, I think it's important to have some way in your life that you push back on that. So it doesn't have to be a big action. It can be signing petitions. Vicki Raymond talks about resistance teams or solidarity teams, sorry. And these are teams where you kind of meet and you talk about like what's working for you, what's not, how you're going to kind of resist some of those deeper injustices as a way to push back, right? Okay. So how do you kind of navigate and become resilient around spirituality? Because one of the things we know is that as you go on in this work, that people lose hope. And we call it talent drain because they leave nonprofit work, right? And these are usually like, I mean, there's a lot of talent in nonprofit work, right? But people don't stay in it for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is like feeling hopeless, feeling that their work doesn't matter or that they can't make a real difference, right? So one of the ways to combat that, we call it compassion satisfaction. And that means that there's a deeper meaning and purpose in your work that mitigates some of the hopelessness, right? So here's my question for you. So what part of your life, it doesn't have to be work, it can just be your life. What part of that is actually creates hopefulness for you, right? What part of that is purposeful for you, that creates meaning for you? And just, I know that's a big question. And I know sometimes people have a hard time kind of like grabbing onto that, but think about that for yourself. Like, what is it that's personally meaningful for you? I read a stat once that said 60% of people in nonprofit work have some kind of personal attachment to it. So they've experienced some kind of injustice themselves, or they've known someone close to them, right, that's made an impact on them, who's experienced some kind of injustice. So so the meaningfulness for them is sort of pushing against that, feeling like they're making a difference in that area. So you can type it into Sarah. You can write it down for yourself. I'm just going to wait for about, I don't know, a few seconds because it's a long time on air. But I just want you to grab onto that. What's purposeful for you? What brings meaning into your life? Another way to kind of grab onto that is to think about like, how did you end up in this field? How did you end up doing this work? Right? What attracted you to this?
For me, it was very simple. I started out cooking in different nonprofits, and that's what led me into my mental health work. But it was wanting to feed people healthy, good food that made them feel satisfied, like giving people access to food that just that simple kind of, here's something really delicious, and I want to make sure that you have a chance to eat it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's different for everyone, I think, right? Like what's meaningful for people.
Do you want me to
And then
summarize some of these
oh, sure.
nuggets?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So some really amazing things here. The opportunity to treat people with respect, affecting change in someone's life, helping to fight addictions, the idea that volunteering is an important part of who we are, and the idea that no one is beyond hope, because personally that message is so important to that person. This idea of making a difference, like that the work you're doing is actually impacting people in a positive way through access, through respect, through resources.
Great.
Yeah.
Yep. Great. So I just want you to take a moment now. We've done a lot of information. Put your hand back on your chest. Take a deep breath and let it out slowly. Just pay attention to what you're feeling in your body. Okay. So we're going to switch modes and talk a little bit about vicarious trauma now. Or sorry, compassion fatigue. So this is basically, emotional and a physical piece that goes with it, that happens when you can't, for people in the helping field. So this is cross sort of helping fields, when you can't refuel and regenerate, right? So when you're always running on empty, basically. And so some of the symptoms we see in this is unclear boundaries. So I can give you an example from my life right now about what's going on with this. So with COVID, it's like there's a lot of pressure going on for me in terms of work, the kind of work that's happening. I'm sure it's similar in other people's lives too, right? There's lots of like crisis right now with clients and so on. And then I have my own family and trying to, right? Like I'm trying to help people, but I'm actually in this place too where I've done the crisis and the crash, right? The crisis and the crash. So what's happening for me around unclear boundaries is where I'd normally have good boundaries. It's harder for me to have those boundaries right now, right? And I'll be like, why did I say yes to that? I should be saying no to that, right? So that's part of what happens actually with compassion fatigue, is it's like the defenses you normally have that would be a normal boundary for you just kind of crash, right? Like they kind of get flooded. And we stop being able to kind of say like, this is my boundary. Anger is really common. So anger is an interesting one. So anger is tied into compassion fatigue. But these are all just like labels that describe actually a set of symptoms, right? So with anger, like what you can do with anger is actually, so it's a secondary emotion, which means that there's often an emotion underneath it. So I think of it like I'm picturing in my head an iceberg and anger on top, and there's actually something else going on underneath it. So so this can be another emotion. This can be an unmet need, right? So sometimes people get angry if there's a barrier to what they actually need or want. And so what I would encourage people to do is kind of reflect on that. So when you're angry, what's getting in your way, right? What's your actual feeling? Sometimes it's sadness or pain, and anger is kind of like this way to cope with it, because it's easier to be angry than to be sad or in pain, right?
I could give you an example from yesterday.
Go for it.
You want. Getting my family out the door to have fun is really hard. And I started getting really ramped up and started yelling at everybody and was super angry. And then I realized that I actually felt sad because my partner had said, well, I like enjoying things, because he was taking a long time with breakfast. Yeah. And I was like, but so do I. I want to be a part of a team. And I just started crying because I was like, oh, I'm actually not mad at everybody. I just feel like I'm lonely and I wish my family would be on my team, you know?
So what you were actually needing is connection and understanding. That was actually the underlying need, right?
Yeah, because I felt misunderstood, and I was being misunderstood
Yeah.
because everybody was like, oh, she's so angry and running around and trying to get everybody ready. And why is mom so mad? And I was like, well, because I want to be
Yeah.
with you guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was really interesting. And it worked out. We actually talked about it. And hopefully,
And
I mean, it's so
that's
hard
a
to get out
normal
of it.
reaction. Like the reason this is generalized around anger is because that can be people's first thing, right? Is they feel
Yeah.
angry and they don't know why they're so angry, and it may not even make sense to them, like why they're getting mad at so and so, or why that person's ticking them off so badly, or like whatever it is, right? But it
Hmm.
can be tied into compassion fatigue. I've also heard it as a way to self-regulate. So conflict is a way to self-regulate,
Oh, interesting.
or bring yourself back to yourself. Yeah, right. It's an interesting concept. Um, so the idea here is that like if you can get that tired energy out, that those feelings you have, that in some way it will help you regulate yourself. If you want to know more about that piece, a really good resource is nonviolent communication. Um, yeah, Marshall Rosenberg, I think the name is. He's the guy that came up with it. If you ever see YouTubes of him, it's quite hilarious because he talks with the puppet, like audiences of adults. It's quite good. But anyways, that's a really good resource for sort of like learning to communicate without violence, which I think is really key in every part of our lives, right? If we're talking about social justice, like there's micro injustices as well, which can be communication. So cynicism, so something you might see if somebody's like really having a lot of symptoms of compassion fatigue is that they're really negative, right, about things. So you get the people that have an idea about the way they could do the program differently or serve the clients better or whatever, and then you have the person saying like, that's never going to work, right? So cynicism is really a key. So people who've worked in the kind of have untreated or unchecked sort of compassion fatigue stuff going on, or maybe just not understanding around it, is that this can really bring down a team because you have the person who says no to everything, right? And is super negative about all the ideas, all the new things, all that stuff. And what I'd say about that is to kind of see that with compassionate eyes, to see it as actually a symptom of compassion fatigue, and to actually talk about it like that within the organization. And maybe that person needs extra care, right? Like outside of work or something like that. Depression and anxiety. So these two are kind of catchwords for a bunch of different symptoms. So depression is like feelings of lowness, right? Emotional. It could be emotional numbing as well. You can have a hard time sleeping, eating. You notice changes like that, right? Anxiety, so feeling stressed out or alarmed, I would say is a better word for that. So feeling alarmed, and it might not always be logical. It's usually not. So your brain might be like, this is no big deal. And your body's like, yeah, it's a huge deal, right? So anxiety pieces. The other way people cope, which is kind of what I was talking about before, and this might be happening to you if you're feeling a lot of like, just your system's like overwhelmed by what's happened, is you get the avoidance and the not caring. So I am numbing out, I'm not caring, right? Sometimes the way this comes out with clients is we call it the silencing response, right? So we try to shut clients down because we actually can't hear it. It's a way of distancing, right? So as I go through some of this, like the thing to know about this is this can bring up lots of feelings of guilt with workers because almost everybody at every level of the organization actually want to help the population they work with, right? So we're supposed to be really, there's this like narrative about how we're supposed to be as workers. And this kind of contradicts that or counteracts that. So what I want to say about that is that you should perceive these as signs to yourself and as sort of like move into a space of compassion towards yourself and think about like, what are these things telling me about what I need right now, right? We go back to the hand on the chest. What are you needing? What are you needing in this moment? What are you needing in the bigger picture of your life? Like, what are you needing right now, right? and not take this as like criticism of yourself. Like, don't allow your brain to be that judgy, critical voice in your head, because that's not what this is about. And this is also like, I'm a firm believer that you can't do helping work for a very long time without having some kind of symptoms of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, something like that going on. Okay, so forgetfulness is another symptom. On an organizational level, you might find that people are absent a lot. So on a personal level, that means you're calling in sick a lot because you just can't face your day. Feeling professionally helpless, so you don't actually know what to do when stuff goes down at work, or when things happen with clients, right? Or feeling like whatever you're doing, it's not enough, it's not okay, it's not that it's not okay, but it's not enough, right? You feel that like piece of yourself that's insufficient. That can be a compassion fatigue piece. And then exhaustion. So feeling exhausted, feeling tired, waking up in the morning and feeling tired, feeling like you didn't sleep, right? Feeling like all you want to do is crawl into bed. Those are normal sort of responses to compassion fatigue. So let's look at burnout. Burnout can be a bit different. So burnout's different because, so when we're talking about it in a work environment, what we're usually talking about is either really difficult work circumstances. So sometimes people call it like a toxic workplace or something like that. Or it can be a mismatch between people and their work they're actually doing. So they might be wired to do people work and they're doing administrative work, or they're wired to do administrative work, but they're doing people work and they're feeling exhausted all the time, right? And it's basically like we all have these batteries, we all have so much energy to expand in a day. And if all that stuff gets sucked out, right? So it gets sucked out through like criticism, through inflexible policy right now, I would say, with COVID. And I know, so in saying that, I also want to know that organizations are limited, right? Because of unions and all kinds of, and they need to run their programs and all that kind of stuff. But that can be a depleting piece, right? Things that would recharge your battery are like having a conversation with a colleague that feels good for you, right? Being complimented, being encouraged in your work, those kinds of things. It can be feeling emotionally exhausted. So feeling like you're just spent, like you have nothing to give anybody. I want to go on, but first I want to acknowledge that it's 11, and I believe this webinar was for an hour. Is that right, Sarah?
No, we have an hour and a half.
Oh, perfect. Okay, good. I'll just keep motoring right along then. So mental distancing from job, criticism, negativity, we kind of talked about some of that stuff, right? It's a way to push against some of the stuff that's happening. What I see happening sometimes is because people are in the part of their brain that's actually like the stress part of their brain, that gets disconnected from the part of their brain that actually makes good decisions and is able to problem solve. What I see is a lot of like riling against stuff without actually problem solving it, right? And it makes total sense because you're actually in that part of your brain, which is the mid part of your brain, that is the fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain, right? So your body's actually in the stress response part of the brain, that it's really hard to actually think things through and make good decisions and figure out how you're going to respond to so-and-so and figure out what you're going to do about X, Y, and Z, right? So the thing that also happens along with this is people typically have a sense that they're not like accomplishing much at their work. Oh, I just slipped by that. I want to show you that. That's a cool thing. So this is actually the process of burnout. This is actually how it looks. So it can be that there's excessive expectations. So expectations, and this can be personal or it can be put on you by, your workplace. So this happens a lot in nonprofit because our caseloads are so big, right? But there's actually like, we might not have enough hours in our day to actually manage what we're put on our plate at every level, I would say. So there's excessive expectations. So how do we respond? We want to be a good employee. We want to do well for the people we serve. So we work harder, right? We work harder, we spin our wheels faster. But that doesn't always result in the outcome we're looking for, right? It doesn't always meet those expectations. So we rev it up, right? We're still going to work hard. We're still going to see if we can do it, but there's no results. So we get really angry, right? We get angry because there's a barrier to what we actually want to do. And then all that emotional energy and all that physical work and all that stuff that goes into it results in sort of a mental and physical exhaustion, right? And then we get exhausted and we get cynical because what we're doing isn't working. And there's this sense of hopelessness that kind of sets in, right? Nothing's ever going to change, all that kind of stuff, like self-talk stuff. And like not being able to believe that things will ever get better. I mean, that's really tied into hopelessness, isn't it? And then finally, there's the collapse piece. So that's kind of the process of burnout. What I would say about this process is that it's simplistic because people go back and forth, and it's not necessarily a linear process for people, right? Because different things happen. There's different pieces to the puzzle that go on here. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual physiology of chronic stress and what that actually looks like. So there's two pieces, right? There's the actual stress symptoms that happen in our body, and there's the stressors. So the stressors are actually what activates the stress response in our body. And they're anything that you can see, hear, smell, touch, or imagine that could do you harm. So these can be external stressors, right? So it can be work related or money related or family, time, whatever, expectations, whatever it is. And these can be less tangible and less visible stressors as well, like self-criticism, right? Body image stuff going on, identity, memories, or feelings you have about the future, right? So our bodies are basically wired to interpret and manage threat, right? So we can survive. So the way this looks is that that stress is a neurological and physiological shift that happens in our bodies when we encounter that threat. So let's say a lion is chasing you, right? So your brain notices the lion and activates the stress response, which basically sends like this cascade of neurological and hormonal activity that initiates physiological changes within your body so that you can survive. So the long and short of this is it activates a system in your body that shuts down everything that's not essential and pumps hormones right to your muscles. Because if you see a lion, what are you going to do? You're going to run. You're going to run or you're going to fight it, right? So, so like your heartbeat increases, right? Your blood pumps faster. It increases your breathing, right? Shallower but faster breath. Your muscles tense up. Are your bodies doing this with me? My body's doing this as I'm saying it. I'm putting my body into a stress response. So your sensitivity to pain actually diminishes. So that's why sometimes when you deactivate the stress response, you'll notice like pain in your joints and like things like that, right? Your attention becomes really narrow and focused, right? It's very short term, here and now thinking. And you're actually in part of your brain. The longer you're in the stress response, the less connected it is to your prefrontal cortex, which is the front where if you put your hand on your forehead, it's that part of your brain. That's the part of, we call that executive functioning. So that's problem solving, good decision making, being able to initiate tasks, stay motivated with tasks, all those good things, right? But it actually, so the amygdala is the part of the brain that's actually the stress response. It looks like two almonds side by side. So that part is what's activating. So when you hit a stress response, that part activates and it interprets the stress. It sends your body into this like physiological response. So when your body goes into that physiological response, the other thing that happens is it shuts down all non-essential services kind of thing, right? So it shuts down things like digestion, reproduction, right? Tissue repair, all those sort of non-essential services of your body. So you can imagine, right? If you're stuck in this chronic stress for a long time, what kind of wear and tear that has on your body, you know? Okay. So I'm going to go back to the amygdala. So the amygdala gets triggered from a threat. So let's say a client starts yelling at you, right? So your body starts triggering, your brain starts moving its sensory response into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? Into that amygdala. And what happens is the longer you stay there, right? It's like your hands are on the cliff and they slowly let go in terms of its connection to the prefrontal cortex. So that means that your ability to actually problem solve and stay with what's happening becomes less and less. So when people really get upset and really flip out, like what we say is like you lose your mind, or like you lost it, but you're literally losing the connection of your brain to that really good place where you can make good choices and problem solve something, right? Flipping your lid. This is true with clients as well. So when people are in that place, they actually can't think things through. So what you actually need to do is help calm the system. So you do that through regulation. You do that through breathing. You can also take a break. So this is like acute stress, right? So you can take a break. So it takes 15 to 20 minutes for your nervous system to regulate on its own and to kind of get back into that mode where your two parts of your brain are connected again. So just so you know, if you're fighting with your partner, you can take a substantial break, not 2 minutes. Anyways, let's go back to my analogy with the lion here. So let's say you're confronted with the lion and your body does the change, does the stress response change, right? So here comes a lion and you're flooded with the stress response. What do? You run, right? You see that your goal is actually to get away from the lion. So your body gears up for that and it runs. So our bodies are actually evolved, right? You run or you fight. If you had a weapon of some kind, you could fight, right? But our bodies are actually evolved to use that energy in some way. But what happens in our world is that we don't have a lion, right? And we have chronic stress. So we have stress that goes on and on and on and on. So we get all the same adrenaline and cortisol and all those things that happen to us, right? But we do it like in a meeting, if somebody's being a jerk, right? So we have to like sit on those emotions because we're not going to run, where it's probably not socially appropriate to like punch the person, right? So you're just going to kind of sit on that. So what happens is like, so first of all, there's a few things that can happen. One thing is we stay in that stress response, which is actually tons of wear and tear on our body and can actually create chronic stress related illnesses like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, right? So we have to find ways to actually complete our stress cycle, to tell our bodies they're safe. And I always think of this as reconnecting to myself. So I have to find a way to get out of that mind, out of that brain where I'm focused, right, on the stressor and kind of deal with the internal stress. Because you can have a stressor and the stressor might go away, right? So you're finished your meeting and the annoying person and whatever is gone. The person that's creating all this stress for you is gone, but you might still be in that physical place of stress response. So let's talk about some ways that you can actually break that. And actually, okay, so I'm going to talk about this really quickly. So the main way we're involved to deal with this is through movement. So this is cardio movement. And I'm going to get Sarah to talk about this because we had a really good conversation right before this, and she was telling me some things that she knows about this.
Oh, yeah.
So Sarah, do you want to just...
Yeah, so at my workplace, there was a marble staircase that was about 100 years old, and it was spiral, and it took your breath away to walk up it. But when I would have an intense interaction with a client where my aggression and my stress response would go up, I would run up and down that staircase just a couple of times, and it totally got that adrenaline and those hormones out of my body. And that took, 5 minutes. I'd sometimes have to wait until I was done dealing with customers or, I had my break, but then I would just run up and down the nearest staircase. I've done that when I've been anxious or scared as well. You know, when I teach mental health first aid, I remember teaching at a hotel and I started getting triggered around one of the subjects I was teaching on. And so at break time, I just went and found the nearest staircase and ran up and down it. That really works for me. And then we were talking this morning about there's specific types of cardio. And we often think of these things as all or nothing, like you have to have a gym membership, you have to go every day, you have to work out for an hour, blah, 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 right? Well, actually, no. You just need to get your heart rate up for a significant amount of time, and do that in a way that makes sense for you. So this morning, my kids were fighting, and there's lots of drama leading up to this webinar, and I had about 10 minutes, so I just put on a HIIT workout, which got me sweating and breathing hard, and I just did that for 8 minutes. So I think it's about doing things that are actually possible, because oftentimes we think, well, if my work wasn't so stressful and I wasn't so exhausted when I got home, maybe I would have more time for the gym, or I could take up running or whatever. But actually it can be simple as a staircase or a couple of push-ups, anything that gets your heart rate going to get those hormones just out of your body in a way that is positive, instead of out of your body in a way where you're yelling at your partner or you know, doing something that has a negative impact on someone else.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
I think it's important in these times especially to make sure you're moving throughout your day. One of the handouts is sort of like some suggestions for creating those connections at work, and one of them is around sort of like, how do you move at work, right? And there's some suggestions there around sort of like just doing 10 minutes around your block, right? Walking for 10 minutes around your block, or doing stairs, or getting up and going to talk to somebody instead of emailing them. I know it's not as fast and efficient, but if you've been sitting for a long time, that might be a way to do it. Even if you've just been sitting and talking to people, like standing up and stretching, or like creating some kind of like movement alleviates the physical part of the stress cycle, and it tells your body like, I'm actually okay here, right? The other thing I like to talk about when I talk about this is to separate this from any kind of like stuff you do around like to be fitter, thinner, whatever those things are, you know, that go around in our heads, because this is actually something else. So it can be part of that. So if you work out regularly, that's awesome, right? And that will totally suffice. But sometimes what's like kind of what Sarah was talking about, right? That gets really big and onerous. And what you need to do is actually focus on small ways that you can work out, or you can like move that energy. So I'll tell you, for me, like I'm upstairs in my office at my house, and I have family, I have a kid, and sometimes I do sessions that are heavy. And so I have feelings about that, right? So if I was in the workplace, what I would do is I would talk to somebody about that. I would say like, hey, I had a really hard session. Can you talk to me about it? Right? At home, I don't do that. But I still have the same physical needs, right? So I get up and I have kind of a routine, like a transition routine I do, where I stretch out, I close my computer, I do some breathing, right? I do some of the exercises to ground myself. And then what I actually do is I compartmentalize the feelings. Because if I go back down to my family and I have those feelings and I'm responding to those feelings of sadness or whatever it is I feel for the client, right? They pick up on it, especially my kiddo. So she'll respond to those feelings even though she doesn't know what's going on. And this can happen in the workplace because feelings are contagious, right? So, and really, if you are in like some kind of leadership position, then actually also you kind of have to manage the emotional field of everybody, right? What's happening emotionally. And I know it sucks because as a parent, you do that too, right? So people will respond to whatever your emotional field is. So that's where regulation comes in, and that's where kind of trying to move through your day, trying to think about moving through your day is helpful. What I want to say about COVID right now is if you can move, that's great. but also know that this is an overwhelming time. And if that feels like another thing that you have to think about and do, and you're at capacity, just do the bare minimum you can do, right? So if you're sitting somewhere now, why don't you stand up and just do a little stretch? So you can do whatever feels good for your body, or you can put your hands up in the air. If you want to stay seated, or if you have to stay seated, that's okay too. Put your hands in the air, kind of bring them down. If you want to bend over and touch if you're able to, touch your toes or somewhere on your leg or whatever, kind of stretch out your back, right? And while you're doing that, what I want you to do is actually stay connected. Stay connected to what's happening in your body and how that feels in your body, right? Maybe roll your shoulders a few times if that's something that's speaking to you, backwards and forwards, right? Get those cues in your body to say, like, I'm actually okay here. So the other one is the breathing one. So you can sit back down or stop or do whatever. If you want to continue, please continue and listen if it's feeling good for you. The other one is the breathing thing we were doing. So the key is the extended exhale. So breathing in and then extended exhale, right? That whew. If you're in a place where you feel comfortable, you can make that sound. That sound is helpful. So the other things that tell you are safe is laughing. So this is like, like that gut laugh, right? That's so funny. And humor can be a big way of resisting. And I know in a lot of these fields, there's humor that maybe wouldn't be like kosher outside of this industry, but we use the humor to cope, right? It's a coping mechanism. And it actually tells our body we're safe. If you're doing it with other people, that's the best, because another way to tell your body you're safe is community, right? Trusted, respectful community. So if you're laughing in a group, that's money, right? That tells your body together, like communally, that you're safe. Everybody's okay. The other thing that's helpful is crying. I think lots of us have lost our ability to cry, but crying actually is a way, it's interesting. Crying's a really interesting thing. So it helps regulate your system, right? It helps regulate your nervous system and connect with yourself. But the other thing it does is it helps you adjust. So what crying does is crying helps you think of new ways to actually cope with something. So if you're feeling like you're stuck in something and you're crying about it, that's actually a really good sign. Because chances are that when you're finished crying, you'll have some new thoughts and ideas and creative pieces around it, which I think is really interesting. Positive interaction. So we've talked about that a little bit. Now, the thing I want to add to what we've already talked about in terms of relationships is that research has found that even interactions that are minimal, so interactions where you're saying hi to somebody who's walking by you and, you're just walking past them and you say hi to them, that's helpful, right?
Actually, Amanda, I just want to say really quickly, I made a connection with a parent who does drop off when I do it, when school is in session, and it turned out we went to high school together. So we made this really cool connection at a birthday party. And then a few days later, I was at school drop off and I was feeling really, really shitty. And he just walked by and all he did was nod at me and say, "What's up?" And it made me feel so much better. It was like the tiniest acknowledgement, but it was like, oh, I know this person and we're good. And he just said hi. And it changed my whole morning. Just that one recognition. And so a lot of times we think with our clients, their problems or their trauma is so big, but sometimes it's just knowing their name or acknowledging them or saying good morning in a way that is genuine, that can really make a difference.
Yeah, totally. I think like we're talking about safety, and one of the cues for us is from other people, right? To know that we're safe. But the other, if we're talking about feeling better, I think sometimes what happens is like when we're not in a good place, like if we're experiencing a lot of compassion fatigue or burnout, or our symptoms are quite like intense, then I think what happens is it can get exaggerated in our mind, and we think that what we have to do is something big, right? Something life-changing, like move cities, get a new job, like something big. And what I always encourage people to do is to think of like on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at, right? So let's say you're at like a 4. So then it's like, okay, so how can you shift this to 4.5? What would it take, right? Or to 5? Like you do incremental things, because those are actually things that seem more in our capacity, and it kind of builds momentum, right, to feeling good. Affection is an interesting one. So having a 20-second hug with somebody who you trust can relieve, it's like a physical piece to it. So it relieves the stress, it completes that stress cycle. It says to you and your body, I'm okay, right? Do you guys know Gottman? Gottman he's a researcher, John Gottman. He researches marriages. He's from Seattle, and I would say he's probably like the leading researcher right now on marriage. And he talks about like I'm going to say 20 seconds. I don't know how long it is. I think it's 20 to 60 second. I think 60 seconds is a long time, but kiss with your partner, right? For you to feel connected to them, which I think is like interesting, because you can't really like not be liking them and have kind of a longer kiss with them, right? But yeah, just as a way to kind of think about affection and how to feel safe and that kind of thing. The other thing that I think is marginalized sometimes, but is equally as important in telling your body you're safe, is creativity. So whatever that is for you, right? Think about your creative self. What does your creative self want to get into, right? That can be a real way of like processing, like writing fiction or painting, or I don't know, whatever it is that speaks to you. It doesn't even have to be something that traditional, right? There's lots of ways to be creative. You can be creative in the way that you interact with people. You can be creative in the way that you, whatever, decorate your house. Like, but if that creative expression shifts your brain and it tells yourself like you're safe, right? What's resonating with you? What's coming up for you? What's something that you're thinking about? You can type it into Sarah. If you have any questions, please ask them. I'd love to answer them. Part of webinar is that I can't have dialogue. So this is the next best thing. And it's also helpful for other people, right? Because really what we want to do is create community. We want to create normality in what's happening to us, that we're not the only ones, that what we're experiencing isn't an anomaly. It's actually pretty normal for this work, especially this time, right?
So Amanda, I have a question around, someone's hoping you'll talk a little bit about how to respond to clients when they're telling you about their trauma and are very nonchalant about it, but what they've actually gone through is horrific. So do you, or how do you let them know it's a big deal, but not re-traumatize them? Or how do you deal with the fact that you're responding stronger to their trauma than they are? It's kind of a complex question there.
Yeah. So with clients, what I would say is you need to like pace with clients, right? But you also can't not have the response you're having. So I think the first key is actually what this person is already doing, which is acknowledging to themselves that they're actually responding. They're having a stronger responses than their client. So first you have to recognize it, which is awesome. The reason you don't want to over respond to something or to respond with a stronger emotion than somebody else is it can actually be quite like oppressive in a sense, because what happens is you're taking the onus from them, right, on their process. So people might not actually be in the place to process that trauma, right? Because usually, so you know Maslow's hierarchy, usually people need to feel safe, right? So that means like physical safety, and also mental safety. By telling you that, I'm imagining that you have a good rapport with clients and that you're quite like skilled in your work because you've already established that connection, right? They're already telling you something. And I think to keep the door open is pretty important. Okay, so I'm wondering a little bit if you're asking how to stay present with them and not get wrapped up in it. Because
Yeah.
if that's the case, if that's the case, what you actually need to do is acknowledge to yourself it's happening, and then do the stuff that you know how to do that we've talked about in this webinar to actually stay grounded in yourself. Okay. Well, also, so I'll tell you what those are. So that's the deep breath, right? So you probably can't do a big deep breath in front of your client. One of the things you could do though is you can ground yourself. So you ground yourself by thinking about your body. So you think about your feet on the floor, right? You think about, if you're sitting down, what your butt feels like in the chair. If you're not, you can just think about like what your body feels like in that moment. And you can do this with eyes open. This isn't an eyes closed thing. This is an eyes open thing to do with clients. It's a way to ground yourself, because I think part of what's happening is emotional flooding, maybe. So you do that piece and then switch to thinking about your breath in and out. And then you focus on something in your environment. So there's a purple water bottle in front of me, and I'm going to notice everything about it. So the color, the texture. I want you to focus on something in your environment. Now what I want you to actually do is do all three together. So try and see if you can feel your feet at the same time as your breath and the same time as your bottle, or not your bottle, like whatever you're looking at. So you try to do all three together. Now here's the thing about that. The thing about that is you need to practice that a lot before you can do it in a situation where your emotions are elevated and your body might be going into a threat mode. Yeah. So your neurons actually have to build neural connections to be able to do that activity. And what you're practicing by doing your anchor image, so that's the image in your environment, is what you're actually practicing is staying connected to yourself while at the same time paying attention to what's happening in your environment, right? So you want to stay embodied, you want to stay in your body, but also pay attention to the client. And then what I would say about that is that you actually need to talk to somebody about that piece. You need to do something with that. So if talking doesn't work for you, you got to do something creative with it. You got to do something with that information so that you can actually process that, because that's not yours, right? So I'm wondering if that's helpful and if that answers that person's question.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that it kind of touches on is actually a bigger piece around advocacy and what our role is as frontline workers and caregivers, because there are things that happen to people, our clients, and it might be that we want to encourage them to seek help, or let them know that what happened to them was actually not okay, when it might just be part of their life experience. I wonder if you want to talk a bit about that. Like, where's the line there? If someone
what I would say about that is you need to ask the person what they want. Because I think, like, when you're a person who is marginalized, you get a lot of people telling you what they think that you need. So you can say to them, like, yeah, that sounds really horrifying, right? Like, if that's honestly your perception of what's happening. But I would say you need to ask the person, and some people out there might, like, I haven't worked in the homeless sector for a long, long time. So some people, even if people want to comment on what they do around this stuff, but what I would say from the client work I do, what you actually want to do is ground it in what the person wants. Because maybe they don't want to do therapy right now. Maybe they don't want to do all that stuff, right? And maybe their pathway for healing doesn't look like what you think it should look like. Right? So what you want to do is actually, like, ally almost with them and get them to tell you what they want. They might just want to tell you that, right? They might actually not want to do a whole bunch of work around it, or not be in a place where they can get the sort of help that you think they need, or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just noticing that we're at our time here.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
and really appreciating how open and honest and clear people have been in sharing the comment section. It's a privilege for me to actually facilitate that part, because I get to see a lot of what you're thinking through and what's resonating with you. And I know a lot of people are really appreciating normalizing feelings, and also the emotional regulation suggestions, and how important the awareness and self-care is for our field of work. Those are some of the themes that are coming up.
Thank you.
So we've got a couple more slides here. Did you want to quickly just wrap up, Amanda?
Yeah, I want to say that if people want to, like, if they need to go, if they have other stuff they're doing, that's totally fine. I'm happy to stay on and kind of finish this up with people if they want. I think this is the last section.
Okay.
So this is around mirror neurons. So in our brains, we actually mimic each other. So you see this in little kids, right? They mimic what people do, so they'll copy you. And we keep doing it. Interestingly, so mirror neurons basically means that, like, when somebody has an emotional expression on their face, we take on that expression too, or we take on their action. So when I do this, like, live, like in front of people, what I sometimes do is I'll say, like, hey, I have a glass of water here, I'm gonna drink it, right? So I drink water, and then what's that like for you? So usually there's at least 5 people in the audience that'll take water and drink it too, right? Or people start noticing, like, oh, I'm kind of thirsty, right?
I just took a sip of my coffee.
Yeah, there you go, right? Like we're wired to connect. Our brains are social, we're wired to connect. We have these things called mirror neurons. Really interestingly, in kids or people, I guess, who have autism, so autism is a social disability, I would say. So it's a inability to sort of like meet social cues. And those kids actually have less mirror neurons, right? So they have a harder time cueing into what's happening, which I think is really interesting. Anyways, so I want to talk to you a little bit about breaking mirroring, because what happens with clients is sometimes we take it on and take it on and take it on. And I know that this field attracts people who are, I would say, maybe in the more sensitive contingent of the population, like sensitive in terms of like sensing the world. Emotional sensitivity, but also physical sensitivity, right? Here I'm going to be talking about sort of taking on other people's feelings and things like that. But I would say we have a plethora of neuron mirroring in this sector. And it's important to not it's going to happen, and to realize it's happening is important. But it's also can be important to actually break those connections so that you're not always in it, right? So if somebody's escalating, you're not going along for the ride. So somatic things can help. So you know that exercise I did with the feet and the breathing and the anchoring image, anchoring object? Like, that's something really good to practice, because what that does is it helps you stay grounded as well as connected, right? Connected to what's going on. In terms of breaking the neuron mirroring, that is another thing that can break it, is your awareness of yourself. So when somebody tells us about trauma, one thing that can happen is we kind of get sucked into the story, right? And we kind of forget about our own self in it. So part of breaking that is to actually become aware of your physical self. Like, what does your body feel like, right? Awareness of how you're breathing. And even those little things can break some of that, right? Where you're going along for the ride, right? And I just want to say this isn't about compassion, and this isn't about empathy, because I think we usually have that in spades, you know, unless we're having some kind of compassion fatigue symptom going on, right? Where we're overloaded. But I would say baseline, that's what I experience in the sector on all levels. So cognitively, one thing you can do is you can imagine an activity. So is there an activity for yourself that brings comfort? It can be your reading socks. For me, it's water. I love water. I feel like so calm in water, right? So for me, just to imagine swimming gives me like this sense of, like, I can feel my body kind of letting go, right? And then, so the important piece around this though, is you got to practice it. It's like a muscle, right? So you got to practice it before you go into, well, I was going to say a session, but any interaction with a client, right? So you kind of have some like prepared things around it. The other thing that can be really helpful is transition rituals. So, so this is a way to kind of process some of those feelings that you may have taken on from clients, like even physically, like even not to your own, like it's just what your mirror neurons are doing, right? But to have some kind of rituals around that. So I was telling you about stretching out and that kind of thing. Normally, so normally after work I walk somewhere. So whether that's, so when I'm working in the office, I have to walk to the SkyTrain. When I'm working from home, I'll usually like walk around the block or something. So this is not in COVID. This is when my family's not at home with me. And I kind of think about things, right? I can see the mountains from where I live. I like looking at that. I can see the mountains from the SkyTrain. I like looking at that. And it kind of just helps me process, like I have some ritual around it. It might be helpful to share amongst ourselves, like other people have rituals around this to process. I knew a social worker who worked in palliative care, and she had a little like shrine, I guess you'd call it, set up by her house, by her entrance, and she would light a candle when a client had passed, right? It's kind of her own process, and she had a little pillow there, and she'd sit in front of that just for a few minutes, you know, as part of her process of like letting go of some of the stuff. Okay.
Good.
If there's you know rituals that you would like to share that are helpful, that's really good. I remember in one of my seminars with hsa-bc in one of the conferences, somebody said they imagined themselves taking off like their work suit. You know, like there's a zipper from their head down to their toes or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. It's probably not exactly what the person said. But kind of taking that off, right? Shedding that skin of work. So as our last thing here, what's your takeaway from today? What's something resonating with you? And then my other question is, if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat, because it's helpful for me to know and kind of tailor what I talk about.
Mm-hmm. And you can also include those in the survey that will pop up shortly.
Perfect.
I want to kind of wrap up just because I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to fill that out and connect. But you can also connect with Amanda directly. She's a fantastic person, great person to talk to. I've learned a lot from her, especially about debriefing and many other things. And here's how to get in touch with her. I know she has good boundaries, but I also know that she is available to talk to you. Mm-hmm. So don't hesitate to reach out to her. And you can get in touch with us at our website. You can give us a call. You send us an email. There's a whole section of sector resources. This webinar will be up in video and podcast format, as well as the handout, which didn't work today, but it will be on our website for you. So that's the slides from this presentation. And you can get in touch with us anytime. Like I said at the beginning, we're tailoring our training to what you need. And we're also really wanting to hear from you about what kind of resources, research, and training that you need in your organization. So Amanda, thank you for being with us today. It's always such a good, solid, practical, helpful information that you share. And we're looking forward to being with you again. And thanks for everybody for being on the line. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for everybody for taking the time to be here today. Stay safe, stay calm, and take a break when you need it. All right, take care, everyone.